Very few comic characters have been as special and as groundbreaking as Gwenpool. What started off as a random joke blossomed into one of the greatest Marvel comics ever made, full of hilarious jokes, complex character exploration, and genuinely heartfelt moments. But over the years, Marvel hasn't really known what to do with her, and that is a huge shame, because when handled well, there are few characters that compare. So today, let's take a deep dive into the history of Gwenpool, and see how she evolved from a simple Deadpool parody to one of the greatest Marvel creations of the past decade. Hello and welcome to Comic Drake, where I talk about comic books and my name is Drake. Let's talk about it. Now, of course, one of the reasons that I love Gwenpool is because she has a great character design with a fresh and unique art style, and if you're looking for a game that scratches that same itch, then look no further than Dislyte. For those that haven't heard, Dislyte is a game that's set in a futuristic, comic and manga-inspired universe, where individuals receive divine powers from ancient mythology, from Greek to Japanese and even Egyptian folklore. These characters are all over the place, so whether you prefer big muscular dudes, pop idols, or fluffy monsters, Dislyte has you covered. And man, the characters just have so much style, and I wish I could afford some of those clothes. What's even cooler is that each of these characters is accompanied by in-depth stories that not only serve to let you know about them more intimately, but they also fill you in on the game's vast and intricate setting. For each version update, Dislyte releases a huge event with new characters and stories, and now is the perfect time to jump in with the limited time Endless Summer event featuring the Chinese god Zhao Tu and massive rewards. To get started today, just click the link in the description or scan the QR code to hop right in, and be sure to use my code FIGHTWITHGODS to get 5 free draws. But now, let's get back to the Gwen action. In the lead up to the Spider-Verse event, Marvel released several one-shot comics that featured new Spider-Folks, with the absolute breakout star being Spider-Gwen, a version of Gwen Stacy that got bitten by the radioactive spider instead of Peter. To say that Spider-Gwen was a huge deal is a massive understatement. The fans went absolutely nuts for her slick design and fell in love with the book's aesthetic. So, in an attempt to capitalize on this, Marvel put out a bunch of new Gwen variant covers for every single book they were publishing at the time, which featured everything from the Gwenvengers to Gwoot. But on the cover of Deadpool Secret Wars #2, the Gwenpool character was created. And much like Spider-Gwen before her, the fans went nuts. Without so much as a comic to read, cosplays and fan art instantly erupted all across the internet, and Marvel, desperate to ride the hype, decided to make her an official character. But here's the thing. Deadpool is a mutant, and the film rights for those are held by Fox. Gwen Stacy, on the other hand, is a Spider-Man character, and the film rights for those were held by Sony. So to avoid throwing their new potential cash cow into the middle of this three-way tug of war, Marvel told writer Christopher Hastings, most well known for his hit webcomic The Adventures of Dr. McNinja, and editor Heather Antos, most well known for posting a selfie of her and her co-workers drinking milkshakes, which the toxic side of the comic fandom turned into a gigantic controversy called Milkshake Gate. I swear to God, you cannot make this up. Marvel gave Hastings and Antos the mandate that by no circumstances can Gwenpool be connected to either Deadpool or Gwen Stacy, or else the studios might try to snatch up the film rights to her. Though, despite this, when Gwenpool made her first appearance as a backup in the Howard the Duck comic, she was basically just a Deadpool clone, a zany, violent sociopath that's more obnoxious than entertaining. Look, it's no secret that Deadpool is one of my least favorite characters. Humor is subjective, and while I have no problem with folks enjoying his over-the-top antics, I personally think he's cringe. And for me, of all people, to have been won over by Gwenpool and have been singing her comics praises for nearly a decade, that means something. Gwenpool's origin is what happens when you take a Deadpool clone and mix it with an isekai plot. It's like someone took a blender and threw in a chimichanga with a dump truck full of self-insert fanfiction. Gwenpool, spelled P-O-O-L-E, has an entire origin of being a huge comic book fan from our real world, and she's now living out every fan's dream of being transported into the Marvel Universe. Well, that would be the dream, except she has no powers or abilities. And if you're not wearing a mask or a cape, then you're a disposable extra who's probably going to be hit by the Hulk's taxi service. So after going to a super outfit store run by a woman named Big Ronnie, Gwen gets herself a costume of her own. Big boots, no pants. While I overall thought that the first story was uninspired, somehow my full-time job is to be a comic book historian, and when Marvel released a Gwenpool Christmas special later in the year, I gave it a fair chance. Right off the bat, you'll notice the new art style is amazing, and that's because it was done by the legendary Japanese duo Gurihiru, who many of you might recognize from their outstanding work on the Avatar comics. So now armed with the costume, Gwen has become a freelance mercenary, and this time around, she needs to fight a big evil snake guy. The comedy here was quite a bit better. I actually laughed pretty hard at Pool trying to learn how to sword fight off of YouTube, but then she got so frustrated that she instead learned how to build bombs, which, although it helped her finish the job, I guarantee it put her on every no-fly list known to man. I overall thought that this issue was decent enough, so when Marvel decided to finally give her a solo series of her own in the form of the unbelievable Gwenpool, I picked up a copy, and it hooked me in an instant. Pool's whole demeanor in the first issue is carefree to a fault, noting that she's likely not going to die since this is probably like her first issue or something. And when MODOK forcibly tries to recruit her as his henchman, Gwen laughs in his face. I mean, come on, it's freaking MODOK. How dangerous could he possibly Yet MODOK straight up kills her friend, forcing Pool to come face to face with the fact that in this world, there are consequences. It is a truly wonderful first issue that clearly sets up an emotional journey of self-exploration. The early part of the series focuses on Gwenpool's misadventures, alongside her fellow henchmen like Captain America villain Batroc the Leaper, whose whole thing is that he can jump really well. And this is alongside new original characters like the mad scientist Dr. Megatoni and the spellcaster Terrible Eye. Having almost ruined their first outing, Batroc quickly realizes that Gwen has no powers. She can't fight, and she can't even hit a target that's right in front of her. All she has is an intense love for the Marvel Universe, but that's not enough to keep her teammates out of danger. Thus, Batroc decides to become a mentor to Pool. There are so many great moments from this part of the comic, like when Gwen gets a meeting with Doctor Strange, who summons the ghost of her dead friend and also magics her a social security number in this world. I also love the whole bit about how coming from the real world gave Gwen a sort of cosmic accent, which is the official explanation as to why her word balloons are pink instead of the usual white. And who could forget Gwenpool defeating MODOK, taking over his organization for herself, and then unleashing her own squad of henchmen called the Pool Boys. Most importantly though, the best part about Gwenpool as a character is that because her whole thing is just being a comic fan, there is an actual reason for her fourth wall breaks, and as a result, she has limits by being confined to what she actually knew before being transported into the Marvel Universe. Again, this is somehow my full-time job, and I am constantly learning new stuff about comic history every single day. That said, Pool is by no means a casual, and she still knows a fuck ton of stuff. It probably doesn't hurt though that when I interviewed Christopher Hastings, he said that she probably watches this channel. Now this one is a slightly selfish question. Does Gwen watch Comic Drake?
I think it would only make sense.
Look, if this channel is good enough for Gwen, then what's your excuse for not subscribing? Please, I am so close to 500,000 subscribers. But now that her solo series had dropped, Gwenpool was a runaway success, and almost immediately she was being shoved into other books as the crossover and getting featured roles in video games. But I'm not gonna mince words here, they sucked. The worst part though is that these crossovers are pointless and add nothing of interest with the character. She simply shows up, goes on a wacky rampage, and then dips out. Compare that to my favorite Deadpool crossover, Doom War. Dr. Doom's army tried to take over Wakanda, and because he is the ultimate tactician who is able to plan and counter every possible move, Black Panther brings in a force of pure chaos and randomness that even Doom can't predict. Deadpool. That is so clever, and even if it was just a shallow ploy to try and build interest by bringing in a more popular character, it was at least well integrated into the story. But on top of that, folks other than Hastings just straight up gave her Deadpool's powers, such as the Marvel Puzzle Quest entry, where Pool is able to talk directly to the player in her information tab. And while she would later go on to distort reality within her book, this level of manipulation wasn't something that the character could do at the time. But for those that think that I'm just going on another anti-Deadpool tirade, here's the thing. The comic itself goes out of its way to explain that Gwen and Wade Wilson are different characters with different vibes. See, one of my favorite arcs in the series is when the team of mercenaries are stuck in an RPG that's brought to life by the villainous arcade, and the NPC keeps referring to this unkillable beast, who just so happens to be Deadpool. And remember those fourth wall limitations that I mentioned earlier? Yeah, Gwen doesn't read Deadpool comics because she thinks he's too LOL memes. She's literally me for real. And you know what? This is such a great use of Deadpool. Once he discovers that Gwen is a fellow fourth wall breaker and that he's just a guest star in her book, he turns the table. He's been at this for so much longer, and the average non-reader probably assumes that she's just a Gwen Stacy variant. Meanwhile, Deadpool is one of the most popular things that Marvel has ever made. The only reason that anybody made it out alive was because Gwen was like, hey bro, I don't like you, but since Arcade is the bad guy here, how about we team up and just beat him up together? Now, don't get me wrong, the comic was great from the get-go, but the second half is where the series goes from good to legendary. Obviously, the idea that Gwen comes from our real world is interesting, but how exactly she got to the Marvel Universe was a mystery. And man, let me tell you that nobody was prepared for this long-awaited flashback issue. We find out that Gwen is a high school dropout who lives at home. All of her friends had moved away, and she has no desire to get a job. Her only income was being a part of a study on the collective unconscious that pays her like $20 a week. Fed up with her life and the mundane world around her, Gwen breaks into the testing facility and cranks that big old science machine to 11, which seemingly opened up a portal to the Marvel Universe, but her brother talks her down. End of issue. Which is interesting because, okay, if a literal portal isn't how she got transported, then what kind of force would be powerful enough to be capable of it? Except hang on, Gwen can see the ending text. Because Gwen is in a comic, she can't flash back to the real world, so by necessity, she would have to relive it within the book herself. It's through deviating from the flashbacks that Poole discovers that she can see and interact with the borders of the book, and she can freely move in the gutter space between panels. She can physically erase the barriers of reality itself. After physically ripping herself out of her flashback, Poole is hunted down by future versions of Miles Morales, Terrible Eye, and a Doombot from a previous story that I'm not going to get into in this video. Because yeah, if you're just watching comic book videos on the internet, then there are a whole lot of great stories that you're missing out on by not reading the book for yourself. And in case you are from Disney's legal team, these videos are covered under fair use, because if these videos can't act as a meaningful replacement for the product, it's fair game. It's why I blank out the word bubbles, bitches. It turns out that in the future, Gwen uses her powers to become the greatest villain the Marvel Universe has ever known. And much like someone playing Undertale, Gwenpool got bored of all the fictional characters around her, and out of sheer curiosity, she used them as her playthings to such an extent that she revealed everyone's deepest, darkest secrets, leading to the biggest and bloodiest superhero war of all time, which, come to think of it, just sounds like the comic book version of Mean Girls. Hoping to take out Gwenpool before her powers fully developed, the Future Squad were working in secret to stay out of the sight of the evil future Gwen's omniscient eyes. That is, until Miles' flashback manifested her into the past. Evil Gwen shows her younger self that in this world, everything truly is consequence-free. She instantly kills the future Miles Morales, but since editorial can't let that happen, bam, that was just a dream. But even if everyone around her is a work of fiction, these are still characters in a world that present-day Poole loves. You don't just spend hundreds of hours immersing yourself in these stories if you don't have a connection to them. And thus, by deciding to stay on the path of good, Evil Gwen gets Marty McFly'd. Tragically though, because Future Gwen was a powerful villain, she became one of the most popular Marvel characters in her era, and as a result, she stuck around for years. Though now that present Poole decided to be a hero, she can see that her pages are quickly running out, as Gwen literally stares at her impending cancellation in the face. In an attempt to stay relevant, Gwen tries her hand at being a villain by running a heist with Batroc, which features a great scene of quietly busting open a safe by Gwen grabbing all the onomatopoeias. But after a touching heart-to-heart where Batroc encourages Gwen to follow her heart and still try to be a hero, she cries and gives him a big hug, because after her cancellation, it's likely that his next writers won't keep this interpretation of the character, which effectively kills off the mentor that she had come to love and respect. Gwenpool comes to terms with her impending death and accepts her fate, but then she's approached by a new future version of herself, one that's a hero and a lot more mature. She shares with the younger self that as a comic character, she can't really die. She'll be reborn when the trade comes out. She'll be reborn when someone reads the book for themselves. She'll be reborn when I read through the series again for this very video. Maybe fans of the book will work in the industry and put her in a new version of the Great Lakes Avengers. We'll get there. But anyway, the end of the comic is a huge montage of Gwen getting to live a long and fulfilling life, highlighting that the future is unwritten and that anything is possible. It is a truly heartwarming ending, and even though it leaves the reader wanting more, it still serves as the perfect conclusion. Unfortunately though, you either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Following the conclusion of the unbelievable Gwenpool, Gwen was brought on as a member of the newly reformed West Coast Avengers team, and in it, she was severely nerfed with none of her meta powers. Also, the team's first villain is MODOK in a bad disguise, and Pool doesn't even mention her history with him. Instead, she gets this hateful romance shtick with one of the biggest shitheads in all of Marvel Comics in an attempt to get more screen time. Look, I don't dislike the West Coast Avengers comic. It was fine, but nothing too special, and it does have its good moments, like when Gwen and Quentin are sneaking into a bad guy's lair by posing as their minions, and were outed because of their obviously pink hair. And when the real henchman demands that they tell them the password, Gwen guesses 8? Which was actually correct, but since they were clearly surprised that it was the right answer, they were double caught. Hands down though, the best part about this comic is that it gave us Pool's pet, Jeff the Land Shark. He's an adorable little cinnamon roll that quickly became a fan favorite and even got his own line of webcomics, which he absolutely deserves because he is the best boy. The West Coast Avengers was an incredibly short-lived series, and Gwenpool was definitely relegated to side character without much to do outside of her side plot with Quentin. But luckily, fans were treated to a brand new miniseries, Gwenpool Strikes Back. And this is the most conflicted that I have ever been about a comic book. The whole point is that Gwen has one last chance at proving that she can be a long-lasting character, and she tries every gimmick and shtick that she possibly can to become more interesting to the reader. It's a neat premise that follows in the footsteps of Gwen becoming a hero in the first place, to avoid being... But the execution was bad, with all of its flossing and dabbing and thought bubble memes and cutaway jokes and unnecessary trivia about shark biology. She even talks directly to the reader and has a little chibi version of herself for jokes. She's gone full Deadpool. She has word balloons that are so big that they fully engulf the page, which is something that she specifically said she hated about Deadpool comics. The second issue even has her becoming Deadpool's protege, complete with a flowchart explaining that the only difference between them is being earnest. Gwen, you went from criticizing LOL memes to becoming LOL memes. You're not supposed to be proud of being the S rank of cringe culture. Again, there is nothing wrong with enjoying that humor, but it's not what made fans fall in love with Gwenpool. But if the larger comic audience just wants Deadpool with boobs, then sure, give them what they want. After all, the entire point of this comic is for Gwen to change everything about herself in order to become popular. Oh. When the comic originally came out, I made a video that blew up, that talked about how, as much as I would hate to see it, I would frankly rather see this character that I adore die off and become forgotten to time, rather than live on as something completely unrecognizable. And like, in the very next issue, many of my concerns were directly addressed. In order to fight the Hulk during a big swimsuit death tournament, because comics, Gwen uses her powers to recruit all of the various versions of herself from the past, which highlighted the wildly inconsistent depictions of her. Also, there's a funny bit about Pool trying to recruit quote-unquote Gwen Prime from the original variant cover. The Christopher Hastings incarnation of Gwen is mortified at who she grew up to be, and I felt so validated. And in the final round of the tournament, Pool had to face off against her friend Ms. Marvel, who notices that Gwen is not okay and is clearly having a manic episode, which is when everything clicked into place for me. See, I personally have clinical bipolar depression, and although I haven't had a manic episode in years thanks to a combination of therapy and amazing medication, boy howdy do I still know what those are like, and this comic made a whole lot of sense now. Gwen has a panic attack and lashes out at Kamala, but luckily Ms. Marvel is able to de-escalate the situation and get to talking about Pool's fear of cancellation. Kamala speculates that Gwen's origin of being from our real world is fake, and that she's actually a reality warping mutant who came into her powers during adolescence, and it's those powers that altered her memory and perception of the world, thinking that they're all a bunch of comic books. It makes perfect sense, right? Gwen has always been a comic character. How could she possibly be from the real world, and yet Christopher Hastings is the one that named her parents? It's a really contrived explanation that comes out of left field, but Gwen just goes along with it to make Kamala feel better, even admitting that she knows she's not a mutant. So once again, Pool looks at her impending cancellation. But suddenly, a Krakoan gate appears, because by accepting Kamala's explanation, Gwen managed to retcon her own origin. So yes, she is officially now a mutant. Which is kind of funny that years later, Kamala herself would be killed off and become a mutant. Huh. 2 nickels. In the end, Gwenpool gives a big monologue about how this book was a way to help her mature and get on the path to becoming the future Gwen from the end of her solo series, which makes sense, and it is the best conclusion that the story could have asked for. It doesn't change the fact that the first 2/3 of this comic are still a cringe fest though. However, Gwen actually did make a comeback in a new series called Love Unlimited. Haven't heard of it? I'm not surprised. It's one of Marvel's webcomics that's built for phones that are attempting to compete with Webtoon. And you know what one of the biggest genres on Webtoon is? Romance. And now you understand why this exists. Gwen's new scheme of sticking around is getting involved in a good romance, and I think it's a neat idea because it's a whole new genre with a new set of tropes to play around with. And I also adored how the gutter space is completely different because of the vertical scrolling nature of the format. It's a pretty short read where Gwen tries to get into a tragic no-touch relationship with a mutant who decays everything that he touches, like a Rogue Gambit situation. But when it's revealed that he has control over his powers now, she instead tries to force a love triangle. Though when that doesn't work out, Poole considers that she might be bisexual and gets into a relationship with Julie of the Power Pack. But when things started to get steamy, she panicked. It turns out that Gwen is aromantic and asexual, and the entire book was an exploration of her discovering and coming to terms with this identity. I think it's an interesting premise that's handled pretty well, and it's a type of queer story that isn't explored much in mainstream media. The issue, though, is that because it is a less commonly talked about story, the final issue is just a heavy-handed explanation of what asexuality even is. I personally don't have an issue with it, but I understand why some readers might be turned off. Then again, I don't think any of those people would have been reading a webcomic called Love Unlimited in the first place. Although Gwenpool has had her ups and downs throughout her history, I'm still holding out hope for her to be revitalized and to get more stories that recapture that magic of what made her original book so good. Because you want to know how she made it into the Marvel Universe in the first place? Christopher Hastings said in a goodbye letter at the end of his series that it was the fans who were responsible. Because they made so much fan art and cosplays, this jokey variant cover was elevated from a simple idea into a real character. It's the love and support that we as fans have that allows her to exist, and it's my hope that with even more of it, she'll be back better than ever before. So head on over to your local comic shop, boot up your copy of Marvel Unlimited, or head to your local bookstore to pick up copies of characters that you love. Because it's us as the comic book fandom who collectively come together and breathe life into a massive universe that we can all love together. And if you're interested in more comic history, then you might want to check out the video that I did on the rise of Ms. Marvel and how she got to where she is today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.